I remember the first time I realized something was wrong. It wasn't fear, not the sharp kind that makes your hands shake and your thoughts scatter. It was more like a pressure, low and steady, somewhere in my chest. It started with the screaming. My neighbor mentioned it the day I came back from another business trip. I brushed it off at first. I have always kept my life in strict order, especially my home. Everything locked, everything double-checked, every entry point secure. There was no room for surprises, not when half my life is spent in airport lounges and empty hotels, solving problems that aren't mine, and returning to a house that's supposed to be my haven. My job has always been about control, about fixing other people's chaos. Maybe that's why I can't handle disorder in my own space. So when Greg, my neighbor, said there had been noise, screaming even, I almost laughed. I had been out of town and only my parents had keys. No one else could get in. It didn't add up. I tried to ignore it. I walked through the front door and locked it behind me like that could close out the uncertainty. The house was almost aggressively clean. The floors shined, the mirror sparkled, the air smelled like a mix of lavender and something too sharp to be comfort. I noticed my bed first. The sheets were tight, the pillows fluffed, everything arranged with clinical precision. My mother always meant well, but this was too much, even for her. She said she'd only watered the plants, but the kitchen was spotless, the spice rack reorganized, everything in place. It was like someone else had taken over the rhythm of my life and left no trace except for the unsettling sense that nothing belonged to me. I tried to push away the suspicion. My family had always hovered close, sometimes too close, but I never believed they would cross the line into intrusion. I reminded myself that my mother liked to help, that she saw tidying up as an act of care. But the edges of my calm began to unravel. The next day, I asked Greg what he'd actually heard. He hesitated, but said there had been people, different ones, coming and going late at night. Not just once, but several times, even months before. Always when I was away for work, always when the house should have been empty. And there was the screaming, not anger or fighting, just something that sounded wrong. He said it had happened in March, in June, and again, now. Each time I was out of town, each time my mother had promised she was only there to water the plants. I looked at my travel calendar. Every incident lined up perfectly. The pattern was too clear to ignore. I hadn't been living alone. My house wasn't just mine. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't stop running through every detail every time something had been just a little bit off. The freshly laundered towels, the subtle changes in the arrangement of furniture, the way the garbage was always taken out even when I'd forgotten. I realized I didn't know what was happening in my own life. The sense of control I built around myself was just an illusion. And now, I couldn't trust even the silence in my own home. It is strange how quickly you learn to distrust the familiar. After that night, I walked through my house as if it was a stranger's, touching surfaces with careful hands, searching for anything that felt out of place. Every room had its own quiet accusation. The laundry was always folded differently, the mail stacked in a way I never would, the faint scent of someone else's perfume lingering in the air when I returned from a trip. These details had always seemed harmless, the small price of having family that cared too much. Now, each one pressed against me with a new weight. I felt watched in my own space, even with no one there. My parents had always operated by their own rules. When I was a child, it was sharing, space, possessions, time. My sister was younger, and anything I had was expected to be split with her. The logic was always the same. Why should I have more? Why should I keep anything just for myself? They used words like community and fairness, but it was never really about balance. It was about keeping the peace, even if it meant carving away what was mine. I learned to give up privacy, to expect nothing to be fully mine, and to make room for everyone else's needs before my own. When I finally moved out, I swore I would build something different. My home would be a place for boundaries, for order, for silence when I wanted it. That dream lasted until my family needed something again. My sister's life was always a mess. 2 kids, constant money trouble, a husband who cycled through jobs. My parents started pushing. She needs space, they said. She needs help. I helped where I could, babysitting, money for repairs, but it was never enough. Eventually, they stopped being subtle. Why did I need so much room for myself? Why couldn't I just sell and give her the difference? They called it sharing, but it felt like being robbed. I said no. I watched the disappointment turn to distance. Family gatherings grew tense. My mother found her way back in with offers of help, watering plants, checking on the house. It was easier to say yes than to fight. I thought I was setting limits, but I was just opening a door. The signs of her presence multiplied. My bed made the wrong way, kitchen supplies rearranged, small purchases that appeared without explanation. I told myself it was harmless, but deep down, I knew I was losing control of the one place that was supposed to be mine. The unease grew worse every time I traveled. I started to dread coming home. My routine became a series of checks, locks, drawers, closets, every corner for evidence of someone else's presence. My mother's texts became more frequent, filled with reminders and suggestions, always ending with some variation of, "Let me know if you need anything." I stopped responding. I thought distance would help, but it only made her more persistent. I became hyper-aware of the patterns. Every time I left, something changed. My absence became permission, whether I wanted it or not. I felt myself shrinking inside my own house, guarding the few corners that still felt untouched. My life outside these walls was built on control, deadlines, projects, complicated negotiations, but inside I was powerless against the people who claimed to love me. I told myself it would stop if I just ignored it, if I just accepted their version of care. But deep down, I was afraid that the more I gave up, the less of myself would be left. When Greg told me about the people coming and going, about the nights filled with screaming, I realized that what I feared most had already happened. My home wasn't a home, it was a stage for other people's needs, a place for secrets and gatherings I was never meant to see. The sense of intrusion pressed against me, silent and suffocating. I stopped trusting the locks. I stopped trusting my family. I stopped trusting the idea that I was safe just because I was alone. If you want to know when everything changed, it wasn't a single moment. It was a slow erosion, a series of small trespasses that built into something I could no longer ignore. The truth was waiting for me, just out of sight, and I finally understood that the only way to reclaim my life was to stop pretending everything was fine. I started planning in silence. I stopped telling my mother about my travel dates. I stopped leaving reminders on the fridge or notes by the door. Instead, I created new routines built on suspicion. I double-checked my calendar, cross-referenced every trip with the dates Greg had mentioned. March, June, now again. Each time I was gone, there was movement in my house. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I bought small cameras, nothing fancy, just enough to hide above cabinets and behind books. I told myself it was to find peace, to finally understand what happened when I wasn't there. In reality, it felt like a final act of desperation, a last effort to take back control. Before my next trip, I went through every room with the patience of someone bracing for disappointment. I looked for new scratches on the floor, checked the windows, changed the passwords to the security system. I packed my suitcase quietly, feeling more like a guest than an owner. I sent my mother a message, polite, distant, specific. Just water the plants, nothing else. She replied with a joke about cleaning, but I didn't smile. The first night I was away, I watched the feeds. I told myself it was pointless, that nothing would happen. My mother came by in the afternoon, watered the plants, tidied up as always. She didn't linger. That night, everything was still. I felt foolish for suspecting her, for spending so much energy on paranoia. But the next evening, just as the light faded, the front door opened again. I watched as strangers entered my home. I didn't recognize any of them. They moved with confidence, as if they belonged. They didn't look around, didn't hesitate, didn't treat anything like it was borrowed or forbidden. They carried bags, bottles, folding chairs, each with their own purpose. There was no hesitation in their actions, no secrecy. It was as if my house had become a public place. I watched as more people arrived as they moved through rooms I once considered private. They laughed, poured drinks, rearranged my furniture to suit their needs. Someone played music, someone dimmed the lights. I sat in my hotel room hundreds of miles away, unable to move, unable to speak, staring at the screen as if it could give me answers. I recognized the blanket on the sofa, the rug in the hallway, all the small things that made the house mine, claimed by strangers who didn't even know my name. I tried to focus on work calls, tried to pretend nothing was happening, but the images stayed with me. I thought about the screaming Greg had mentioned, about the possibility of something darker hidden beneath the surface. I waited for my mother to call, to explain, to confess, but the silence was absolute. My phone only rang when someone needed me for something else. A meeting, a deadline, a reminder of the life I was supposed to be living outside these walls. I barely slept. The third night was worse. There was no longer any doubt. More people arrived. The gatherings grew louder, more confident. I saw glimpses of things I didn't want to see. My kitchen table turned into a place for their meetings. My living room filled with unfamiliar faces, unfamiliar laughter. I watched my own life repurposed for someone else's needs, unable to stop it. The sense of helplessness settled in deep. I knew my mother was involved, but I didn't know how or why. I tried to remember every conversation, every offhand comment, every moment when I thought she was just trying to help. The truth was clearer now. I hadn't just lost privacy, I'd lost trust. I realized how little I knew about the people closest to me, how easily they could remake my world without asking. That trip ended with a call from the police. I was still in my hotel room when I answered, trying to sound calm, trying not to betray the panic. The officer asked if I was aware of a gathering at my house. I said no. He explained that several people were there, some upset about surveillance cameras. My parents were present, claiming they had my permission. I sent him the message I'd written, clear, simple, just about the plants. He said there might be consequences, that the city was reviewing complaints. I hung up and stared at the wall, feeling smaller than I ever had before. After that call, my mother finally reached out. She didn't apologize. She just wanted me to confirm her story, to say I had given permission. She talked about community, about helping, about old friends, and new beginnings. I didn't answer her questions. I didn't argue. I just listened, realizing that nothing she said could undo what had been done. I had proof now, not just suspicion, not just unease, but evidence. Hours of footage, messages, the quiet confirmation that my home had been taken from me piece by piece, disguised as love. By the time I returned, I knew there was no way back to the way things were. I had seen too much. I had lost too much. All that was left was to decide what to do next. Coming home after that trip felt different than any other return. My hand shook as I unlocked the door, half expecting to find the living room still full of strangers, the air thick with voices that didn't belong to me. But the house was quiet. The evidence of what had happened was everywhere, but it was subtle, nothing broken, nothing stolen, just the lingering traces of occupation that made everything feel foreign. The pillows on the couch were out of place, the dining chairs pushed back at odd angles. A glass with fingerprints not my own sat drying by the sink. The smell was different, faint traces of perfume, candle smoke, and food I didn't cook. I moved through the rooms, cataloging what had changed and what I would never be able to reclaim. I tried to act as if things were normal, but the illusion collapsed the moment I checked my messages. There was a new message from someone I barely remembered, a name from my childhood, a friend of my parents. The tone was apologetic, as if they assumed I already knew what had happened. They explained they had been invited to my house for a gathering, told it was with my permission. They sent a link to a website used for organizing events like these, private, curated, exclusive. I clicked the link and found pictures of my house, my furniture, my things. Every photo lined up perfectly with the days I was away. I saw the blanket I had bought for myself featured as a backdrop, my kitchen table set for a group, my bedroom in the background of a shot that made me feel sick. There was a schedule, a list of suggested donations, glowing reviews from people I had never met, all describing my home as if it were a venue, a safe space, a place for community and healing. My mother's old nickname was attached as the host. It was clear and deliberate. I sat with that knowledge for hours, numb and cold. My first impulse was to confront my parents, but I knew it would be pointless. I already understood what had happened. Their values, sharing, openness, community, had been turned against me. The house I had worked for, the boundaries I had tried to establish, none of it had mattered when my needs were inconvenient for them. My mother and father arrived a few days later, unannounced. They tried to make it about family, about helping my sister, about needing space for her and her children. They said my house was sitting empty. They insisted it wasn't personal, that they had tried to be careful, to keep things from getting out of hand. I didn't argue. I listened. There was nothing left to say that would change what had already been done. I thought about my sister and how she had benefited, how my parents saw my independence as a resource for everyone else. I thought about the years I spent working, building a space that was meant to be mine, only to see it repurposed for needs that were never mine. I realized I was never going to get an apology that felt real. The most I would ever receive was an explanation meant to justify their choices. The aftermath was quieter than I expected. There were calls from the city about zoning violations, complaints from neighbors about the noise, emails about potential tax issues. Some of the guests who had attended the gatherings tried to contact me, some angry, some apologetic. The website disappeared within days. The evidence swept away as if nothing had ever happened. My parents stopped visiting. My sister blamed me for making things difficult, for breaking up the system that had helped her family. I didn't respond. I began to pack my things. I hired a real estate agent, sold the house quietly, and found a new place farther away, one that felt empty but safe. I didn't leave a key under the mat. I didn't tell my family my new address. I let the silence grow, filling the space between us with all the things that would never be resolved. There was no apology, no understanding, only the knowledge that the lines I had tried to draw had been ignored until I was forced to erase them completely. I grieved the loss of my home, but also the loss of trust, the final realization that sometimes family can become strangers when you need them to protect you most. I settled into the new apartment with fewer things, fewer memories, fewer ties. The relief was not immediate, but it was real. For the first time in years, I could close the door behind me and know that it would stay closed. The sound of my own footsteps in the hallway was enough. I was left with the understanding that the cost of boundaries is sometimes everything you hope to keep. The months after I left that house moved slowly, every day heavy with the awareness that nothing would go back to the way it was. I changed my number, blocked old contacts, muted group chats that only brought reminders of a family that had stopped feeling like mine. I deleted the photos from the camera feeds, but the images stayed with me. Strangers in my living room, laughter over my table, the quiet certainty that my trust had been nothing more than a resource to be managed. The apartment was smaller, quieter, unfamiliar, but it belonged to me in a way the old house never had. There was no noise at night, no traces of someone else's habits, no half-finished cups of tea on the counter. I started to rebuild routines, simple and careful, moving slowly from room to room as if testing the limits of solitude. My parents tried to reach out a few times. Their messages were polite but strained, never addressing what had happened directly. They spoke about the weather, about distant relatives, about news that didn't matter. My mother never apologized, never admitted to what she had done. My father's silence was more complete, as if he hoped the past would disappear if he ignored it long enough. My sister was openly angry. She accused me of selfishness, of betrayal, of putting my own comfort before the needs of family. She told me they had been trying to help, that I was ungrateful, that I had destroyed what little peace there was left between us. I listened to her messages in the same way I listened to the echo of my own doubts, quietly, without hope for reconciliation. The fallout was real, but it wasn't dramatic. My parents faced legal complaints and fines. Some of the guests who had used my house demanded refunds, threatened lawsuits, spread rumors through the small circles my family called friends. The city sent warnings. The IRS sent letters. The social network my parents had relied on collapsed. They became more isolated, and I wondered if they blamed me for the consequences of their choices. I wondered if they saw me as the one who broke the system, or if deep down they understood that the system had never really worked for me. I kept to myself. I learned to enjoy the quiet, to find comfort in being alone. I walked through the city with my headphones in, visited new coffee shops, spent weekends in bookstores. The routines that once felt like loneliness became a source of peace. I let myself feel angry, then let it fade. I realized that forgiveness was not something I owed, and that the distance between us would likely never close. I thought about my old house less and less, until it became just another chapter I had survived. Every once in a while, I found myself wondering what would have happened if I had done things differently, if I had let them keep using the house, if I had confronted my mother sooner, if I had been less strict about my boundaries. The questions never brought comfort. The truth was that nothing I did would have changed who they were or what they needed. My parents were experts in the language of self-sacrifice, but only when the cost was someone else's. My sister had learned the same lesson, turning every request into an obligation, every act of giving into a test of loyalty. In the end, what I lost was not just a house or a family. I lost the illusion that love could survive any betrayal. I lost the idea that being needed was the same as being valued. I lost the sense that I could keep giving without running out of things to give. My new life was smaller, quieter, more contained. It was not what I had planned, but it was mine. No one else had the keys. No one else made the rules. With time, the pain dulled into something manageable. I learned to trust my own judgment again, to believe that I deserved privacy, that boundaries were not a crime. I did not regret leaving. I did not miss the burden of constantly making space for others at my own expense. I learned that survival sometimes means saying no, even when no one understands. Now, looking back, I see how slowly the fracture grew. There was no single moment of rupture, just the slow, grinding realization that my life had become something I no longer recognized. The silence from my family grew heavier with each passing week, eventually settling into a kind of mutual acceptance. We did not reconcile. We did not fight. We simply existed apart, the distance measured in absence rather than anger. I stopped expecting apologies. I stopped hoping for understanding. I built new habits, filled empty weekends with things that belonged only to me. I read more, learned to cook simple meals, let the days pass without the anxiety that someone else might claim a piece of my space. Sometimes the loneliness would press against me, sharp and unexpected. The urge to reach out was real, but I reminded myself of the cost. Trust, once broken, does not heal with time. It changes form. It becomes a lesson you carry, a scar that warns you not to forget. I learned to value my own company, to find comfort in the predictability of solitude. My life was not glamorous, not filled with dramatic moments, but it was mine. There was satisfaction in small things, finishing a book, watching rain streak the windows, knowing that every object in the apartment was right where I had left it. The world around me moved on. My parents faded further into their own troubles. Their circle of friends diminished. My sister found other ways to manage, other people to lean on. The calls stopped. The emails dwindled and then ceased. The last message I received from my mother was brief, impersonal, a holiday greeting with no questions and no warmth. I responded out of habit and then deleted the thread, not out of anger, but because I no longer needed the connection. It was an end that brought neither relief nor pain, just the quiet acknowledgement that what had existed between us was finally over. I thought about sharing my story, about explaining the choices I made, the reasons I refused to surrender what little I had managed to claim for myself. I wondered if people would understand, or if they would judge me for drawing lines where others saw only duty. In the end, I realized that judgment didn't matter. The truth was simple. I protected myself when no one else would. I gave what I could, and when it became too much, I walked away. Not out of spite, but out of necessity. I have learned that boundaries are not the opposite of love. They are the structure that makes real love possible, the permission to say no, to demand respect, to claim the right to peace. I do not regret my choices. The loss of family is real, but so is the freedom that comes after. I do not owe anyone the pieces of myself that I fought so hard to keep. In the end, all I wanted was a home, a place where I could be sure of myself, where silence was not a punishment, but a promise. I finally found that place, not in a building or a city, but in the simple act of standing firm. I hope anyone who listens understands. Sometimes the hardest thing you can do is choose yourself, even when it means letting go of everything else.